Winter chewed at the plains like an old grief that refused to loosen its jaw. The house at the edge of that wide emptiness stood crooked but stubborn, its clapboards silvered by years of wind, its shutters rattling like a tired prayer. Snow had not yet fallen, but the air held the taste of it, bitter, metallic, clean, and the sky pressed low, a leaden lid on a pot that never cooled. Inside, the rooms carried a meek kind of light, the kind that lives in the last inch of a candle, and every beam and nail remembered hands now buried. He paused at the threshold, breath white and thin, the leather of his boots whispering against the door plank. He was a man made of work and weather. He was a man who had trimmed his life down to bone, so it would not hurt to carry. Silence had kept him safe. Silence and routine and the careful way he lifted each day, like a pail he refused to spill. He did not step in all at once. His body knew the rule. One breath at the door, one breath to check the stove, one breath to hang the hat on its hook. Grief had built him a list and he obeyed it. Coat, gloves, boots, then wood, then water. Only after the tokens of winter were counted did his eyes settle on the floorboards, where the knotholes bloomed like old scars. Something broke the familiar lines. A hem, a fold of white turned grey at the edge, a shape curled tight against the draft that crawled under the door. For a long second he thought the house was remembering out loud, conjuring mercy from dust. Then the shape breathed, a small, certain breath, the kind a child takes when the mind dreams of running but the body cannot move. He set his hand on the doorframe and let the cold bite his knuckles the way truth bites when it refuses to be ignored. The dress was the first thing he knew. The lace had yellowed where summer once touched it. The stitched bodice, altered twice by a diligent hand, still carried a thin thread of blue the way some riverbeds keep the ghost of rain. He had folded that dress himself after the funeral, clumsy as a man trying to fold a map he never wanted to read. He had laid it in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, wrapped in one of her linen towels, as if softness could smother pain. The faint scent of the chest rose now, cedar and old soap, a sweetness like the memory of a hymn. It reached for him and stopped at his throat. He swallowed and looked away. On the shelf, a photograph lay face down where he had turned it months ago, with two fingers that trembled only after the deed was done. The glass was spidered in a single crack, a thin lightning frozen in place. This was a house that did not ask for company. This was a house that kept its dead in the corners where light couldn't find them easily. He had built a life around the absence of others. That was the truth of him. Meals he could eat without taste. Work he could do without sound. He carried his grief the way a horse carries an old scar, less a wound now than a map of where danger once lived. The body remembers, the mind learns to hover above it, and the soul does what it can. It keeps walking. He understood this. He did not understand the child asleep in his dead wife's dress. Her hair was tangled and dull, her cheek pressed to the plank as if listening for water under earth. The hem dragged dust where her feet had tucked into themselves for warmth. One of her hands rested open, palm up, the way a hand rests when it finally believes no one will take anything more. His boots made that small sound again, the pause and creak, and her breath changed. Not much. Just a stutter, the body's quiet alarm, the way the chest tightens before the eyes consent to wake. He did not move. He knew what fear sounded like. He knew what it did to the nervous system, how the shoulders lift, how the jaw locks, how the eyes scan for exits first and comfort later. He spoke to horses more than he spoke to men, and he had learned that the softest movements carry the most trust. He bent, slow as cooling iron, and set his gloves on the table instead of the hook, so she would hear fabric, not wood. The house answered him with its old song, the wind worrying the warped shutters, the stove's low iron sigh, the subtle tick of beams expanding in the cold. He noticed the dress again, and the seam along the hem he had never mended. He noticed the torn thread near the wrist, where a sleeve had once caught a nail. And he noticed something else, the smallest glint of metal peeking from beneath the folds at her chest, a pewter spoon's bowl, dulled by use, not by age. It didn't belong to the dress. It belonged to someone's daily hunger. The child had hidden it the way a person hides a portion of themselves they are not willing to lose. He crouched, his knees answering with a familiar ache. Up close, he could see what the cold had done to her lips, cracked them into a fine map, the kind cartographers of hard winters learned to read. A smudge of dirt along one cheek, as if she had tried to wipe away tears and left a mark instead. A threadbare ribbon tied once around her wrist and then tied again, tighter, as if the second knot understood what the first had promised. He felt the old ache shift in his chest, not bigger, not smaller, just changed, like a door you believed was stuck that suddenly moves the width of a coin. He told himself to speak, a question, a warning. anything that would send her back to where she came from, anything that would protect the fragile equilibrium of a life practiced in solitude. But when her eyes opened, what he found there was not pleading and not panic. He found a stillness that did not belong to a child, and a quiet that did not beg to be broken. It stopped the words at the tongue's edge. He thought of his wife's hands, how they had moved through this room gathering the day into order, how they had smoothed linens, how they had righted what tipped. The body remembers, the house remembers, and sometimes memory is not pain. Sometimes it is a path. The cold carried a thin thread of cedar from the chest in the bedroom, proof that the lid had been lifted, that small hands had rummaged where married hands once lingered. He saw it all with a rancher's eye, quick but thorough, the chest key on the sill, a faint smear on the lid, the ghost of a footprint where the floor always creaked, now silent. She had moved carefully, not to steal, but to survive. There was no greed in the way the dress hung from her bones, only need. Only heat borrowed from a life that had ended before hers began. He breathed in once, then again. Counting slowed the noise inside the body. He had learned that much on hard nights, when sleep held itself just out of reach. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. The nervous system unwinds the way a rope unwinds, slowly, with patience, with respect for the knots you cannot yet untie. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, and matched it for a handful of breaths, letting his own pace take its cue from hers. It was a strange mercy, and it worked. His shoulders softened, and his jaw unclenched, and the house seemed to lean a fraction closer, no longer bracing for an order it did not want to hear. He touched nothing, not yet. He let the room do the speaking, the faint clink of the kettle lid settling as the iron cooled, the whisper of wind through the gap near the window latch, the gentle scuff of his boot when he shifted his weight. He set a log on the stove, and did not let it fall. He rolled it into place with the palm of his hand so the sound would be more like a promise than a shock. The flame accepted it with a low approval. Warmth pushed softly into the coal's firm back. The photograph on the shelf waited, face down as it always did, its crack holding the light the way a creek holds sunset. He did not turn it, not yet. The past did not need to watch this. The present was precarious and holy enough. The girl shivered, the dress whispering against the floor, and he reached for the quilt thrown over the chair, the quilt she had pieced in winter evenings when silence did not ache as much as it does now. He hesitated with it, halfway in the air. The last time these threads had covered a body, the body had not warmed. He lowered the quilt anyway, slow, careful. He laid it across the girl's shoulders, the way you lay forgiveness across a wound. Not tight, not loose, simply there, so the body can decide what it will accept. Her eyes tracked the movement, not fearful, just awake. He waited for the flinch, the recoil, the sign that she would bolt. It didn't come. She breathed. He breathed. The house settled by a fraction. Somewhere in the distance a winter bird called once, then thought better of it. He closed his hand around the edge of the quilt and then let go, as if returning a tool to its place. He did not ask her name. Not yet. Names can be heavy, and winter was already heavy enough, but he noticed where her gaze kept returning, the corner of the room where a lantern used to hang from a nail, the exact height where his wife would set it before she braided her hair for sleep. The girl looked there with the familiarity of someone who had memorized the geometry of this room or had been told of it, piece by someone who loved it once. He let the question form and drift. Not all questions need a mouth right away. Outside, the wind made the shutters complain again. 1, 2, 3, a cadence like knuckles on a door. He stepped back to the threshold and stood the way he had stood when he first walked in, only he was not the same man in that first breath. Something had shifted. Not a large thing, not a vow, but something like a hinge that finally found its oil. He felt the breadth of the room, the stove's heat pressing into the cold, the cedar's sweetness rising like a memory that was willing to be kind. He thought he heard her hum, a sound as small as a moth's wing inside a jar. He knew it was only the house breathing around them. He let it be enough. He would not send her out into that wind. Not now, not yet. He didn't speak the decision. He simply took it in his hands the way he took his hat, the way he took the night's chores, and set it where it belonged. The body understands choices made without noise. The heart does too, when the heart is ready. He stood a while longer, the door at his back, the stove's glow on his front, and watched the dress he had sworn never to touch again hold the heat that would keep a child alive until morning. In the language of this house, that was a prayer, and it was answered by quiet. He never wanted a family until he found a girl sleeping in his dead wife's dress. At first the sight was a trespass, a breach in the sealed world he had built from loss and silence. She stirred when his shadow fell across the doorway, lifting her face into the dim winter light. No flinch, no fear. Only a gaze steady enough to stall the words he meant to speak, words meant to send her back into the cold. The dress hung loose on her, its once white hem dragging through dust, threads catching on the warped boards beneath her. It was not worn for beauty. It was armor against the cold, the bodice pulling awkwardly over narrow shoulders, the fabric smelling faintly of cedar and something older, something kept shut away for years. She rose slowly, keeping her hands near the skirt as if its weight alone anchored her here. When he asked her name, it came small, quiet and without certainty, as if she were borrowing it from someone else. A name that might not have been hers. She offered nothing more, no tale of where she'd been, no plea for where she might go, but in the stillness between them, he saw something that unsettled him. Her eyes roamed the room as though it were not new to her. They lingered on the shelf where a cracked photograph lay face down, on the chest where the dress had once slept. Places only memory should know. A draft moved through the house, rattling the warped shutters. Outside, the wind carried the hiss of snow on dry grass. Inside, neither moved. He stood in the doorway, a man used to endings, and she before him, wrapped in a piece of his past. The silence stretched, not empty but watchful, and he realized this was no ordinary intrusion. The wind shifted outside, carrying with it the faint rattle of loose tin on the shed roof. He noticed then that her arms were not folded for warmth alone. Against her chest, she held a small bundle wrapped in burlap. The knots pulled so tight they puckered the fabric. Her hands curled over it in the way one guards something that has already been stolen once. She did not move as he stepped closer, only adjusted her grip. The burlap was frayed along the edges, smelling faintly of smoke and river water. When the light from the stove touched it, the shapes inside became clear, a rounded glint of metal, the corner of a folded paper, the curve of something bound in cloth. He crouched without speaking. The bundle was small enough for a child to carry, but its weight was not measured in ounces. Later, when she set it on the table for a moment, he saw what it held. A pewter spoon, worn smooth at the edges, a ribbon the color of faded lilac, its middle creased from long folding, a map torn from an atlas, 2 towns marked through with heavy strokes, and one more thing, something that caught in his throat before he could name it. It was a keepsake from his wife's family, lost years before her death. A piece that should not have found its way into this child's hands unless someone had placed it there. He looked at her then, really looked. She met his gaze but did not explain, her silence as deliberate as the knots in that burlap. The question came unbidden, pressing in like the winter air through the cracks in the wall. Had she wandered here by chance, or had she been sent? And if sent, by whom? Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, but inside the quiet between them felt heavier than the storm. By the next morning, word had already begun to move in the quiet, unhurried way gossip does on the plains, a steady current beneath the still surface of winter. He took her with him into town, not as a gesture of trust, but because leaving her alone in the house felt wrong in a way he could not name. She sat in the wagon beside him, the dress gathered awkwardly in her lap, the burlap bundle never leaving her arms. As they reached the edge of Main Street, a neighbor on horseback slowed his trot, eyes narrowing as they passed. No greeting. Just the long, measuring stare of a man already deciding what he would tell his wife over supper. At the general store, the murmur of conversation shifted when they stepped inside. The girl stood near the pot-bellied stove while he bought flour and lamp oil, the heat touching her cheeks, but not easing the way she held herself, poised to move, to run, though her feet did not. By the time they reached the saloon to collect a parcel from the stage, the whispers had thickened. A man with no kin, they said, taking in a strange girl who wore a dead woman's dress. In the narrow space between words, the suggestion grew, unspoken but heavy. The preacher's wife intercepted him outside, her voice wrapped in the politeness of someone who believes their way is the only right one. If she needs placing, she offered, I know good people, proper people. Her eyes flicked to the girl, then back to him, as if the decision should be obvious. He gave a single nod, not in agreement, but to end the conversation, and stepped past her without another word. The girl followed, her small steps matching his stride without effort. As they turned the wagon toward home, the wind picked up again, sweeping dust through the empty lots where buildings had burned and never been rebuilt. He knew it would be easier to let the town arrange her fate, to return to his quiet life without this disruption. But ease was not the same as right, and right, he thought, was rarely quiet. The first clouds came low and fast, their bellies heavy with rain not meant to wait for spring. By dusk the wind had found its voice, a long unbroken howl that curled through every gap in the siding. He checked the barn twice, the shutters once, the stove 3 times. The girl sat near the hearth, knees drawn close, the hem of the dress damp from snowmelt that had begun to creep under the door. When the storm broke, it came like a wall, the rain lashing against the house with a force that made the timbers groan. He woke in the black hour between midnight and morning to a sound that did not belong to the wind, a thin voice, muffled, speaking a name he did not recognize. The sound pulled him from bed before thought could catch up. She was not in her blanket. He found her in the barn, barefoot on the cold boards, clutching the dress to herself as if trying to disappear inside it. The lamp he carried cast her shadow high against the wall, small and still but for the quick rise and fall of her shoulders. He said nothing, only held the light steady so the darkness would not press so close. Back in the house, he lit the stove again, though the coals had not yet died. The extra warmth pushed against the cold in the corners, turning the air softer, slower. She sat on the floor, the quilt wrapped around her, eyes fixed on the stove door as if watching the fire might keep it alive. That night he made 2 rounds to feed the flame, once for himself and once for her, and though neither spoke, the sound of the rain eased its grip on the walls. The storm left a stillness behind, the kind that feels both emptied and full. Snow lay in thin patches across the yard, already sinking into the thirsty earth. Days passed with the same measured quiet. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice seemed to come from a place far away, as if the words had been carried a long distance before reaching her lips. More often, it was her silences that told him the most. She startled at the sudden clatter of a dropped pail. Her eyes followed every door, every window, as if keeping count of her exits. When the wind pushed too hard against the roof, her hands tightened in the fabric of the dress, holding it close to her like a talisman. These were not the habits of someone simply shy. They were the reflexes of a body that had learned not to trust its ground. One morning, while chopping kindling, he noticed a small scar along the side of her hand. It curved in a way that was too precise to be accident. Later, by the firelight, he saw the same curve burned into the sleeve of the dress, a faint, dark mark near the wrist. The cloth thinned where heat had once bitten through. He thought of asking, but the question felt too heavy to drop into the room between them. Instead, he let the quiet stand. He knew enough about pain to understand that stories come when the body is ready to set them down. Until then, he would tend the fire, mend the tools, and watch for the way her shoulders eased when the stove's heat reached her back. Some truths were like seeds in frozen ground. They would break the surface only when the season turned in their favor. It happened without planning, the way certain things do when the hands act before the mind decides. Late one evening, while the wind moved slow against the walls, he took the dress from where it hung and set it across his lap. The fabric felt lighter than he remembered, as if time had been quietly undoing its weight. He found the frayed hem and worked the needle through it with the thread his wife had once favored. Pale, sturdy, smelling faintly of the cedar chest. Each stitch landed quiet, the sound small but steady like footsteps in snow. When the mending was done, he left the dress draped over the chair by the fire and said nothing. The next morning, as he sat down at the table, he found an egg from the hen house resting on his seat. No plate, no note, just the single egg still warm from the nest, set there with the care of someone who gives without asking. He moved it gently to the table and took his place. That evening, while sweeping the floor, she began to hum. The sound was unsteady at first, almost uncertain, but the tune was one he knew, a melody his wife used to hum while rinsing clothes in the cold creek water. The girl's voice was softer, but it carried the same rhythm, the same rise and fall. He did not speak, and neither did she, yet the air in the house felt different, as if some door had been opened without anyone touching the handle. The day was brittle with cold when the rider came. His horse's breath steamed in the air, each exhale a ghost that dissolved too quickly. The man sat tall in the saddle, scanning the yard before dismounting. His coat was heavy with road dust, his eyes sharp from distance and searching. Without greeting, he asked after a runaway, a girl, small, dark-haired, wearing a dress that did not belong to her. The girl stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the house behind her. The dress hung around her like a pale flag, but there was no surrender in her stance. She didn't step forward, but she didn't hide either. Her gaze stayed fixed on the man, reading him the way someone reads a horizon for signs of weather. He answered with care, measuring each word so it neither confirmed nor betrayed. His voice carried nothing of the tension in his chest, nothing of the calculation that weighed protection against truth. The rider's eyes shifted between them, noting the silence, the way she held the bundle at her side. Finally, he gave a thin smile that did not touch his eyes. "She's more trouble than you know," he said, before swinging back into the saddle. They watched him ride east until the wind and dust erased him. She stepped back into the house without a word, and he followed, closing the door against the cold. The latch settled with a sound that felt final, though neither of them could yet name what had been decided. Winter eased its hold by degrees, the days stretching a little longer, the cold losing its edge. The dress no longer clung to her daily. Now it hung clean on a peg near the window, the mended hem catching the light, not hidden away but not claimed as armor either. It waited in the open, part of the room's quiet order. They had settled into a rhythm without speaking of it. At first light, she was in the yard, scattering feed for the hens, her boots leaving neat tracks in the frost. He worked the fence where the boards sagged toward the ground, pausing sometimes to watch her move through the chores as if she had always known them. Their days ran side by side, the spaces between them filled with the kind of silence that did not press, but held. One evening, as the air thinned toward night, he opened the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. Inside, folded where the dress had once lain, he placed her burlap bundle. He did not untie the knots or search its contents. The act was not about knowing, but about keeping. The chest closed with a sound that belonged to permanence. When he stepped outside, the door stayed open behind him, lamplight spilling into the cold. From the yard, the glow looked almost like a welcome. Whether it was meant for someone coming or for someone leaving, the wind did not say. The air between them, like the house itself, had learned to hold both.